Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for joining me tonight for another quiet journey into the past. The world outside your window may be still, but together, we will wander softly through the echoes of history, through torchlit streets, marble halls, and whispered stories long since faded into dust. Tonight, we travel not to a battlefield, nor to a bustling harbor, but to the very heart of ancient Rome, a city at once magnificent and fragile, triumphant and trembling. It is the 1st century of our era. The Roman Empire stretches wider than any kingdom the world had known before. From the cold forests of Germania to the deserts of Egypt, from the storm-lashed shores of Britannia to the sunlit waters of the Mediterranean, Rome claims it all. Its roads knit together distant lands, its legions march with discipline, and its emperors sit in marble palaces at the center of the known world. And yet, beneath that grandeur, the empire is fragile. Power is absolute, but also precarious. One dagger, one whisper, one betrayal can topple a dynasty. Emperors rise to thunderous applause, and they fall in silence, their names cursed or forgotten. In such a world, survival depends not only on armies or laws, but on cunning, charm, and the ability to master the shadows that gather in every corner of power. It is into this Rome, glittering yet dangerous, that our story begins. A story not of a general marching with his legions, nor of a philosopher writing lines of wisdom, but of a woman, a young woman whose name would be etched in scandal and legend alike. Valeria Messalina, wife of the Emperor Claudius, Empress of Rome, whose rise was as swift as her downfall was dramatic. But let us not rush to her end. Tonight, we will move slowly, gently, step by step, as though walking down the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill. We will hear the whispers of senators, the laughter of courtiers, the cries of the crowd in the Circus Maximus. And always, somewhere in the shadows, we will sense her presence. Messalina, young, ambitious, underestimated, yet destined to shape the fate of Rome in ways both dazzling and destructive. Picture, if you will, the city at night. The lamps along the Forum flicker in the summer breeze, their light dancing across columns carved with the victories of emperors long past. The marble temples gleam faintly under the moonlight, while statues of gods and heroes cast long shadows across the paving stones. In the distance, you hear the muffled roar of the Tiber River, steady and eternal. But listen more closely, and you will catch another sound, the murmur of voices, low and hurried, drifting through narrow alleys and quiet gardens. Whispers of plots. Whispers of secrets. Whispers of scandal. These whispers are what gave Rome its true heartbeat. Armies might conquer, emperors might decree, but in the shadows of palaces and in the corners of banquets, lives were made and unmade. And in those whispers, the name of a young empress would soon rise, attached to both admiration and dread. Messalina did not come from nowhere. She belonged to one of Rome's most ancient families, the blood of emperors running through her veins. Yet her age, her beauty, and her ambition set her apart. To some, she was merely a child bride, wedded to a stuttering, awkward emperor whom many dismissed as a puppet. But Messalina was not content to remain in the background. In a city where women were often expected to be silent, she learned to speak without words, to command through charm, to gather influence through glances, to move pieces on Rome's grand chessboard with the subtlety of a master. Our story tonight is not simply of her downfall, though that is how history most often remembers her. It is the story of a fragile beginning, a dizzying ascent, and the dangerous temptations of unchecked power. Messalina rose higher than any woman of her time dared, but the higher she climbed, the more perilous the air became. Her tale is one of feasts and betrayals, of laughter at midnight and tears at dawn, of love, ambition, and the quiet, creeping hand of fate. So as you rest tonight, let us walk together through those halls of marble and shadow. Let us see Rome not only in its grandeur, but in its fragility. Let us follow the footsteps of an empress whose name became a cautionary tale, yet whose life was lived not in silence, but in the dazzling, dangerous light of power. The Roman Empire had never known true stability. Power in Rome was not passed gently, like a crown upon a velvet pillow. It was seized, wrestled, snatched in the moments when blood ran hot and daggers gleamed. And so it was in the year 41, when Emperor Caligula, wild, erratic, and feared by his own guards, was struck down in a corridor of the palace. His body was left in the dust, his reign ended as suddenly as it had begun. In the chaos that followed, senators panicked, soldiers muttered, and the empire teetered on the edge of collapse. Who would rule now? Which family, which faction, which rival would step forward to seize the throne? No one expected the answer. For as soldiers searched the palace, they stumbled upon a trembling figure hiding behind a curtain, Claudius, the uncle of the slain emperor. Claudius had never been considered a threat. Lame in one leg, stammering in speech, awkward in manner, he had been dismissed by his family as weak, even foolish. At banquets, he was often ridiculed, mocked for his clumsy laugh and his scholarly obsessions with history and language. While others schemed for power, Claudius buried himself in scrolls and studies. To Rome, he seemed harmless, a man meant for libraries, not thrones. And yet, in that moment of blood and confusion, the Praetorian Guard lifted Claudius from the shadows and proclaimed him emperor. The Senate, caught off guard, had little choice but to confirm it. The man no one had taken seriously was now the master of the empire. For Claudius, it was a strange destiny. He had spent his life underestimated, living in the long shadows of others, and now those shadows had parted to reveal him as ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Some thought the guards chose him because they could control him. Others believed fate had plucked him from obscurity. Whatever the truth, Claudius sat upon the throne, wearing the purple robes of power with unease and humility. And beside him, soon, stood a bride, Valeria Messalina. She was not yet 20 when she became his wife, her youth contrasting with his graying hair and hesitant manner. To many, the match seemed strange. But Messalina's bloodline gave Claudius something he desperately needed, legitimacy. She was the great-grandniece of Augustus himself, Rome's first and most revered emperor. Through her, Claudius tied himself to the divine lineage that Rome still honored. Through her, his reign gained roots in the ancient soil of dynasty. For Messalina, the marriage was opportunity. She had grown up in the web of aristocratic families, accustomed to the rituals of Rome's upper class. To step suddenly into the role of empress was dizzying, yet she embraced it with the eager energy of youth. She smiled at banquets, walked with grace in processions, and soon bore Claudius a son, Britannicus. With his birth, the dynasty seemed secure. An emperor, an empress, and an heir, Rome, at least for a moment, could breathe more easily. Yet beneath the celebrations, there were whispers. Claudius, though emperor, was still seen by many as weak, easily led, too trusting. Messalina, with her charm and youth, drew more attention than he did. At festivals, eyes followed her rather than the stammering ruler. At feasts, her laughter seemed brighter than his voice. To the common people, she was a dazzling presence. To the nobility, she was a reminder that power in Rome could wear a woman's face as easily as a man's. Claudius himself adored her. In his letters, he praised her beauty and loyalty. He leaned upon her counsel more often than others realized, perhaps too often. And Messalina learned quickly how to turn that devotion into influence. The marriage that began as a political match was transforming into something more, a partnership in which one partner, quietly, invisibly, was beginning to guide the other. But in these early years, the signs were faint. The empire saw only the image, a bookish emperor who had stumbled into power, and his radiant young bride who gave him both heirs and legitimacy. Together, they seemed to embody Rome's promise of continuity. Picture the city on the day Britannicus was born. The forum alive with shouts of joy, incense rising from temples, sacrifices offered to the gods. In the palace, Claudius holds the infant awkwardly, a nervous smile on his lips, while Messalina cradles her child with serene pride. Outside, senators bow, soldiers cheer, and common citizens whisper of stability at last. The empire, so fragile after Caligula's madness, seemed for a brief moment whole again. And yet, Dear listener, history rarely rests upon appearances. Behind the tender image of young mother and child, behind the awkward figure of a scholar-turned-emperor, shadows were gathering. For Messalina was no ordinary bride, no passive empress content to remain in the background. Within her stirred an ambition, a hunger for more than ceremony and feasts. Within her burned a spark that would grow into a fire consuming not only herself, but all who stood too close. Rome had seen many emperors, but few like Claudius. Learned, cautious, awkward, he was a scholar on the throne, more at ease with scrolls and histories than with soldiers and senators. He spent long hours bent over documents, dictating carefully to scribes, his speech broken with pauses, his manner stiff. To the Senate, he seemed hesitant, a man easily swayed. To the Praetorians, he was useful, a figure they had raised, and perhaps could control. But within the marble halls of the palace, another figure moved more gracefully, more quietly, and far more effectively. Messalina, still in her teens, watched everything. Where Claudius hesitated, she advanced. Where Claudius trusted too much, she calculated. And where Claudius was dismissed, she was feared. At first, her power was subtle. She lingered in the corners of council meetings, listening more than speaking. She watched which senators bent too eagerly, which officials hesitated before answering, which freedmen whispered in doorways. She saw, with a young woman's keen eye, that Rome was not ruled only in the Senate chambers or the battlefield, but in the quiet exchanges between men who believed themselves unseen. Messalina began to build her own circle. Freedmen, those once enslaved but now entrusted with imperial duties, proved especially valuable. To them, she extended kindness, an extra word, a smile, a promise whispered at a banquet. Soon, favors were exchanged. An appointment here, a contract there. A senator's family granted an estate in return for loyalty. A general's son given a post in the city guard in exchange for silence. Step by step, Messalina wove a net around the empire's decision-makers, a web that stretched outward from her private chambers. It was not only politics. Her charm was a weapon sharper than any sword. Messalina had the gift of presence. When she entered a room, conversations faltered, eyes turned, and even the most hardened senators softened their tones. She could laugh lightly and ease tension, or glance sharply and let silence hang heavy. Claudius adored her, trusted her, and never questioned her influence. What to him seemed natural affection, to others became clear proof. The Empress was guiding Rome as surely as any emperor. Still, in these early years, her ambition remained carefully hidden. She played the role of dutiful wife, young mother, graceful hostess. Banquets she arranged dazzled the court with silver platters, wine flowing, musicians filling the air with melody. Senators went home speaking of her generosity. Yet beneath the glitter, Messalina was testing the boundaries, discovering how far her influence could reach before resistance grew. One story whispered from this time speaks of an official whose appointment was blocked by a rival. Messalina, hearing of it, invited the man's family to dine. She spoke warmly of their loyalty to Rome, pressed a gift into the matron's hand, and smiled. Days later, the rival was quietly removed, and the official installed. Claudius, when asked, explained the decision as his own. But in the palace, everyone knew whose hand had guided it. For Messalina, these victories were intoxicating. Each success confirmed what she already sensed, that her role need not be ceremonial. She was not content to sit quietly beside her husband while others steered the ship of state. She herself could grasp the tiller. And the more she succeeded, the more daring she became. Yet ambition, like a seed, begins small. In these years, it was only sprouting. A network of allies, a taste of influence, a confidence in her ability to shape outcomes. But already, Rome was beginning to whisper her name, not only as a beauty, not only as an empress, but as a force in her own right. Claudius, meanwhile, remained blind to the shadows forming at his side. He loved her deeply, perhaps too deeply, and mistook her ambition for devotion. To him, Her whispers were wise counsel, her favors kindness, her growing presence only a reflection of her loyalty. He did not yet see that she was playing a different game entirely. Picture, dear listener, the palace in these years. The emperor bent over his scrolls in the lamplight, dictating in halting tones, his mind filled with laws and history. And across the hall, Messalina entertained senators and generals, her laughter soft, her eyes bright, her hand brushing across a guest's arm as she makes a promise that will bind him. Two worlds under one roof, one of scholarship, the other of power. And it was the latter, not the former, that would shape Rome's future. The seed of ambition had been planted. In the gardens of the Palatine Hill, among marble statues and murmuring fountains, Messalina walked with her ladies, her young son at her side. She looked not at the flowers blooming around her, but at the city below, its endless roof stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere deep within, she must have felt it, that this city, this empire, could be bent to her will. And from that thought, a hunger grew that would not be easily quenched. In the early years of Claudius's reign, Messalina had played her part with subtlety, smiles in the right places, whispers in quiet corridors, favors exchanged discreetly. But soon, subtlety no longer satisfied her. Influence hidden in shadows was powerful, yes, but Messalina discovered something even more intoxicating, power displayed openly, power savored beneath the bright gaze of Rome itself. And so she began to step out from behind the veil. No longer content to remain at Claudius's side as a silent partner, Messalina appeared in public with her own entourage. A line of attendants followed her through the streets, bearing gifts, messages, and tokens of her patronage. Senators' wives curtsied deeply, gladiators bowed their heads, even freedmen scrambled to greet her. For Rome, it was startling. Rarely had an empress walked with such command, gathering respect and fear in equal measure. Whispers soon spread, stories of her presence at the games, seated not quietly in the shadows but prominently, where all eyes could see her. At the theater, she was said to have laughed too freely, her applause too loud, her interest too keen in the actors and dancers below. And at the gladiatorial schools, where the sweat and dust of men training for blood hung thick in the air, her visits raised eyebrows. Some claimed she took an almost unsettling delight in the contests of strength, lingering longer than propriety allowed. Was it scandal, or was it strategy? Perhaps both. For Messalina had learned that power grew not only from whispered promises, but from spectacle. The games, the theater, the gladiator schools, all were Rome's heartbeats, where common citizens and nobles alike gathered. By showing her face, by letting her laughter and her gaze ripple through the crowds, Messalina bound the city to her presence. She became not merely an empress hidden in marble halls, but a figure alive in Rome's daily life. The transformation was striking. Only a few years earlier, she had been the quiet bride, mocked for her youth, underestimated for her silence. Now she strode boldly, her silks brushing against the dust of the arena, her jewels catching the torchlight of late-night feasts. The girl once clutching a book in the shadows was gone, in her place stood a woman who had tasted power and found it sweeter than any wine. Those close to her began to notice the change most of all. Her entourage, once small and composed of discreet allies, grew larger and more brazen. Young men eager for advancement flocked to her side. Women sought her favor, hoping her smile might grant their families safety or promotion. Freedmen and officials whispered her name with equal parts admiration and dread. For to be seen at Messalina's side was to be marked with opportunity, or danger. Rome, ever hungry for scandal, embroidered her actions with tales of excess. Some whispered that her nights were filled with banquets too lavish, with entertainment too wild, with appetites too bold for an empress. Others swore she had begun to cross boundaries no woman of her station had dared. Whether these rumors were true or exaggerated, they added to her aura. To some, she became a goddess of abundance, bestowing favor with generous hands. To others, she was a storm in silk, unpredictable and dangerous. Claudius, as always, seemed blind. He remained absorbed in scrolls and speeches, in the endless duties of empire. He saw only his radiant wife, the mother of his son, the woman who made his awkward reign appear brighter. He marveled at her energy, perhaps even envied it, never realizing that her boldness was beginning to eclipse his own authority. For Messalina, the hunger grew. Influence was no longer enough. She wanted the intoxication of being seen, of being whispered about, of walking into a room and knowing that all eyes, fearful or fascinated, were fixed upon her. Power, once a secret pleasure, was now a public performance. Picture, dear listener, the contrast, the young bride who once walked quietly behind her husband, her head lowered, her hands folded. And now, the Empress striding into a banquet hall, silks shimmering, her laughter carrying across the marble, her entourage trailing like shadows. Rome's whispers followed her, not as ridicule, but as awe and suspicion. The transformation was complete. This was Messalina's new game, a game no longer played in silence, but in spectacle. And though her rise dazzled the city, it also drew dangerous eyes. For Rome admired power, but it also feared it. And in the shadows of her triumph, resentment began to stir. The marble halls of the Palatine Hill had long echoed with banquets. Rome, after all, was a city that celebrated abundance, wine from distant vineyards, spices from the east, exotic fruits brought by traders across the seas. Yet under Messalina, these feasts took on a new character, something darker, more daring, more unforgettable. It began with dinners that stretched deep into the night. Senators and equestrians, generals and poets, all found themselves summoned by the Empress to share in her table. Golden lamps flickered across the polished stone, casting warm light over bowls of figs, plates of roasted meats, and amphorae of wine poured without restraint. Musicians strummed their lyres, dancers moved like firelight itself, and laughter spilled across the chambers like a tide. But beneath the laughter, the air was charged. Senators vied for seats closer to her, their words dripping with flattery, their eyes searching for a smile, a nod, some signal of favor. Younger men pressed forward with tales of bravery and campaigns, poets recited verses meant only for her ears. To be noticed by Messalina at such a feast was no small thing, it might mean an appointment, a contract, or the downfall of a rival. And so, what appeared as merriment was also a contest. Wine loosened tongues, secrets slipped between careless lips, and Messalina, ever attentive, gathered them all. Every boast, every whispered rivalry, every confession born of intoxication became another thread in the net she wove around Rome's elite. The feasts were not merely celebrations, they were laboratories of power, where she tested loyalties and measured weaknesses. Whispers began to spread through the city. Some claimed her banquets blurred the boundaries of rank and propriety. That nobles dined beside actors, senators beside dancers, generals beside freedmen. Rome was a society built on hierarchy, and to cross those lines was scandal enough. But Messalina reveled in breaking them, reminding all who entered that it was she, not tradition, who arranged the order of the table. Others murmured of her appetites. That the wine was too strong, the entertainments too indulgent, the company too scandalous. Some swore that her laughter carried until dawn, that her chambers filled with a whirl of revelry the city had never seen from an empress. Whether truth or exaggeration, each tale added to her legend, Messalina, the hostess who knew no boundaries, whose feasts outshone even the emperor's own. Claudius himself, absorbed in duties or worn by study, often retired early, leaving his young wife to preside alone. And preside she did, with confidence, with allure, with an authority that was not borrowed but claimed. Those nights revealed a different face of Rome, a city where power was not spoken in the Senate, but whispered over wine, laughed out between songs, traded in the flicker of candlelight. For the common people, hearing of these feasts through rumor, fascination mixed with fear. They marveled at her boldness, her willingness to defy convention, yet they also shuddered at what it meant. Rome was a city of order, of tradition, of rigid lines between classes and genders. And here was an empress who blurred them all, who made senators beg for her attention and generals compete like gladiators for her smile. Picture one of those nights, dear listener. The banquet table heavy with silver platters, the air thick with incense and roasted meat, the sound of cups clinking and laughter rising. At the head of it all, Messalina reclines upon her couch, jewels glittering in the lamplight, her eyes scanning the room with a gaze that misses nothing. A senator leans closer, eager to please. A young poet trembles as he recites lines meant to flatter. In the corner, a general mutters bitterly into his cup, wondering how he has been reduced to waiting for a woman's approval. And through it all, Messalina smiles, a smile that is both generous and calculating, warm and cold. For this is not simply indulgence. It is strategy. Each word spoken, each look exchanged, is a piece in her game. Rome believes it is drinking and laughing, but Messalina is listening, remembering, shaping the fates of men as easily as she refills their cups. The whispers of scandal grew louder, echoing through the streets and forums. Yet no one dared openly challenge her. For all the disapproval, there was also fear. To mock her too loudly might mean exile. To oppose her openly might mean ruin. And so Rome gossiped in hushed tones while its senators and nobles continued to attend her feasts, unable to resist the lure of power offered in her shadow. Thus, the mask began to fall. The quiet bride of Claudius was gone. In her place stood a woman unafraid to indulge, unafraid to bend tradition, unafraid to make the most powerful men of Rome her supplicants. She had tasted the pleasure of influence, and now she reveled in the intoxication of control. But feasts cannot last forever. And indulgence, when carried too far, begins to breed resentment as well as fascination. The line between admiration and fear is thin, and Messalina was walking it boldly. Rome watched, Rome whispered, and in those whispers, the seeds of dread began to grow. The feasts had filled Rome with whispers, but whispers alone do not make a dynasty secure. Messalina understood this truth more keenly than most. Influence gained through laughter and wine could vanish by morning, only fear, sharp and lasting, could ensure survival. And so, behind the curtains of her banquets, another theater began to unfold, one where enemies did not merely lose favor, but lost their homes, their power, even their lives. Rome, in the days of Claudius, was a city where accusation could be as deadly as a blade. To be named in the wrong chamber, to be accused before the wrong audience, often meant the end. And Messalina, with her watchful eyes and her network of loyal freedmen, learned quickly how to bend accusation to her will. Nobles who questioned her influence began to disappear. Some were accused of treason, others of plotting rebellion, still others of moral corruption. In truth, the charges hardly mattered. What mattered was that Messalina's voice reached Claudius's ear, and once it did, the outcome was certain. The emperor, eager to maintain order and trustful of his wife, rarely resisted. A nod from Messalina could unmake a senator. A whisper could send a general into exile. The city soon learned the pattern. An enemy crossed her, perhaps by denying her an estate, perhaps by withholding flattery at a feast, and within weeks, rumors swirled. Then the trial came, swift and decisive. And soon, the rival was gone, executed quietly, or sent away into a lonely banishment where their names faded into silence. Their gardens, their villas, their treasures, these often found their way into Messalina's hands, as if the city itself were offering tribute to its empress. Imagine, dear listener, the atmosphere in Rome during these years. Senators walking through marble colonnades, their sandals tapping softly against the stone, but their voices hushed, their eyes darting nervously to every shadow. Generals returning from campaigns, victorious, only to find themselves on trial within weeks, their triumph erased by a charge whispered in Messalina's chambers. Families clutched their estates tightly, knowing that a single accusation could see their land seized, their children left destitute. It was not always steel or exile. Sometimes it was humiliation, forced marriages arranged, inheritances stolen, honors denied. One by one, those who might have threatened her position found themselves diminished, silenced, erased. Rome became a quieter city, not because it lacked ambition, but because ambition itself trembled before her. Yet even as she rose higher, a strange stillness filled the air. The laughter of her feasts continued, the banquet still dazzled, but beneath the music was a note of fear. Men smiled at her, yes, but with eyes that betrayed unease. Women praised her beauty, but whispered prayers that their sons would not catch her attention. To stand too near Messalina was to bask in glory, or to risk ruin. There is a haunting image we might hold here, the Senate chamber, its marble walls cool and gleaming. Senators gathered in their togas, debating Rome's future, but each speech carefully measured, each word chosen with caution. For they knew that somewhere, beyond the chamber, Messalina's ears were listening. And if a word displeased her, if a gesture betrayed disloyalty, their careers, their lives, might soon be forfeit. She was young still, not yet 30, but already her hand lay heavy on the city. Power was no longer simply charm or seduction, it was terror, quiet and precise. The gardens she claimed from exiled nobles grew lush with flowers, but to the people of Rome, they seemed watered with fear. The villas that changed hands gleamed with marble and mosaics, yet their beauty was shadowed by the memory of those who had owned them before. Even Claudius's kin were not spared. Relatives who might have had a claim to influence, cousins who might have become rivals, found themselves accused and removed. The emperor, perhaps too trusting, perhaps too weary of conflict, allowed it, convinced by Messalina's insistence that she acted for the safety of the dynasty. And so, his household shrank, even as her own power expanded. Rome had always been a city of spectacle, gladiators in the arena, triumphal parades, the roar of the crowd. But under Messalina's shadow, the true spectacle was quieter, darker. It was the sight of empty villas, the silence of vanished voices, the fear etched into the faces of those who remained. Picture, if you will, a senator returning home after a day in the Curia. His toga drags softly across the marble threshold as he steps into his villa. Yet instead of peace, he feels dread. His gardens, once a refuge, now seem fragile, uncertain. Will they still be his tomorrow, or will Messalina's hand claim them? He passes his children playing under the olive trees, but his heart is heavy. For he knows that no victory, no wealth, no legacy can shield him from an empress's whim. This was the Rome of Messalina's making, a Rome where power meant survival, where silence was safer than speech, where every banquet invitation was both honor and threat. The young bride who had once clutched an Italian book in shyness was gone. In her place stood a woman feared across the empire, a shadow in silk, her smile as deadly as a blade. But fear, though powerful, is brittle. It breeds obedience, but it also breeds resentment. And resentment, once seated, can grow like ivy, creeping into every wall, every chamber, every heart. Messalina's triumph was real, her dominance undeniable, but already, the city was holding its breath, waiting for the day her enemies would gather enough courage to strike back. By now, Messalina was no longer only the emperor's young wife, nor simply the hostess of Rome's most scandalous feasts. She had become something far greater, something that made even hardened senators shift uneasily in their curule chairs. She was, in truth, the shadow ruler of Rome. The transformation had been gradual. At first, she had whispered in Claudius's ear, suggesting names for minor appointments, this freedman or that official. Soon, her voice grew stronger, her recommendations less like suggestions and more like decrees. Audiences that should have been reserved for the emperor now quietly included her. Petitioners brought not only their pleas to Claudius but gifts and flattery for Messalina, knowing that her hand could tip the balance in their favor. Coins were struck that bore Claudius's image on one side and honors to his family on the other. Inscriptions praised not only the emperor but the Augusta by his side. Monuments rose that bore her name alongside his, as though Rome itself acknowledged that the empire was guided by two hands, not one. The people who walked beneath those arches and across those marble courtyards whispered to one another, sometimes in admiration, often in unease. That the Empress was no longer in the shadows. Picture the imperial palace in those days, long corridors of polished stone, statues of ancestors gazing sternly down from their pedestals. Courtiers lined up in hushed anticipation, waiting not just for the emperor, but for the empress as well. Doors opened, and there she was, Messalina, draped in silks of deep crimson, her jewels catching the torchlight. She moved with a calm authority, her words measured, her gaze sharp. Men who had spent their lives in politics, men hardened by decades of public life, bowed deeply when she entered, their voices trembling as they greeted her. In council meetings, her presence was felt even if she did not speak. Claudius, trusting, leaned toward her for advice, often repeating aloud the suggestions she whispered softly in his ear. Laws were shaped, policies confirmed, and appointments made with her influence woven through them all. To the outside world, Claudius was emperor. But within the marble walls of Rome's palaces, many began to wonder, who truly held the reins of power. Conservatives in the Senate, men who clung fiercely to Rome's traditions, whispered among themselves in alarm. Rome was not Sparta, nor Egypt, they reminded each other. Women here were to remain in the private sphere, shaping households, not nations. Yet here was an empress whose hand could sway appointments, who had her name carved into monuments, who moved as though she were equal to her husband. They could not deny her effectiveness. The petitions she supported often succeeded. The men she promoted often rose quickly, serving loyally in return. To many common people, she became a symbol of abundance and generosity, the beautiful empress who presided over games, who smiled at processions, who represented Rome's prosperity. But for the ruling class, her ascent was unsettling. Had Rome allowed a woman to rule openly? The contradiction was clear. Rome admired power, even when it broke tradition, but Rome also feared it. And Messalina embodied both admiration and fear in equal measure. Imagine, listener, standing in the forum during those years. Marble temples gleamed in the sunlight, vendors called out their wares, and senators walked in solemn groups, their purple hems trailing over the stones. Inscriptions on new buildings carried her name, etched deep into the stone. Children played beneath statues erected in her honor, while their parents shook their heads in disbelief. For centuries, Rome had been ruled by men, their authority guarded by custom and law. But now, it seemed, an empress sat alongside the emperor, not by name, perhaps, but by presence, by influence, by sheer force of will. And so, the city lived in contradiction. To oppose her was dangerous, yet to accept her was to admit that Rome's ancient traditions were shifting. Many did both, outwardly bowing before her, while inwardly seething at the insult to custom. Messalina herself appeared unbothered by these whispers. She moved with confidence, attended ceremonies with dignity, and presided over her household as if it were a court of its own. She knew her position was unusual, but she also knew it was secure, for Claudius trusted her, adored her, relied on her. And as long as he did, she believed she could not fall. But power, once tasted, rarely remains content with stability. To govern quietly, to remain the shadow ruler, might have been enough for another woman. Yet Messalina's hunger had grown with her influence. Each monument that bore her name was not only an honor but a reminder of how far she had come, and how much further she might reach. The empire was vast, its armies loyal, its wealth abundant. She had transformed from a teenage bride mocked for her plain looks into the most powerful woman in Rome, perhaps in the world. But power of this scale is never without consequence. For every ally she gained, an enemy plotted in silence. For every monument carved with her name, resentment etched itself deeper into the hearts of Rome's ruling class. This was Messalina at her height, a queen in all but title, a shadow emperor standing beside her husband. But just beyond the horizon, the storm was gathering. For ambition, unchecked, does not remain in whispers. It speaks loudly, dangerously, until even the shadow cannot remain hidden. Power had carried Messalina to dazzling heights, but even the strongest towers can falter when built on restless desire. At the very moment she stood as the shadow ruler of Rome, another force began to stir within her, a longing not for more influence, but for something dangerously personal. And it came in the form of a man, Gaius Silius. Silius was everything Claudius was not. He was young, striking in his appearance, noble by birth, and magnetic in presence. Where Claudius limped and stammered, Silius walked with the proud stride of a man adored by Rome. Where the emperor buried himself in scrolls and debate, Silius thrived in games, festivals, and the easy company of the crowd. His laughter was quick, his courage undeniable, and his ambition bright as the Italian sun. When Messalina first saw him, the air around them seemed to still. It began, as such things often do, in whispers and glances. A meeting at the circus, a private word at a festival, a smile held a moment too long. Soon the whispers grew into something undeniable. Behind the guarded doors of Rome's palaces, the Empress and the nobleman became inseparable. At first, their affair was cloaked in secrecy. They met in hidden chambers, their steps hushed along shadowed corridors. Servants, loyal through fear or bribery, kept their silence. But secrecy was never something Messalina could maintain for long. Her nature was not to hide, but to flaunt. As weeks turned to months, she grew bolder. Silius began to appear not just in her private chambers but at her side in public. At the circus games, Messalina's gaze lingered on him while the crowds roared at the races. At festivals, he walked near her entourage, his presence undeniable to all who looked. The whispers of Rome turned into open speculation. Was the Empress keeping not only power but also a lover, bold enough to defy the emperor himself? Claudius, trusting and distracted, seemed oblivious. Yet others were not so blind. Among them was Narcissus, the emperor's secretary, a man of sharp eyes and sharper instincts. He had long studied Messalina, documenting her moves, weighing her ambitions. Now, he watched with renewed focus. Each appearance of Silius beside her, each rumor of their closeness, was another thread woven into the rope that might one day ensnare her. For Messalina, however, danger only heightened the thrill. She flaunted Silius more boldly, as though daring the city to confront her. He was at her feasts, her games, her festivals. Standing where no lover should, his presence a challenge to custom, to law, to the emperor himself. And Rome, fascinated and horrified, watched. Picture, listener, one of those festivals. The streets alive with garlands and music, the air rich with the scent of roasted meats and spilled wine. Amid the throng, Messalina appears, draped in jewels that catch the sunlight, her smile radiant. At her side, not Claudius, but Silius, tall, handsome, resplendent in his tunic. The crowd parts for them, whispers ripple through the air, and yet she does not falter. Her hand brushes his arm, her laughter rings clear, as though nothing were amiss. In that moment, Rome held its breath. For centuries, emperors had been betrayed in secret. Affairs whispered about but never paraded in public. Messalina broke the unspoken rule. She turned what should have been hidden into spectacle, forcing the empire itself to acknowledge her defiance. Why did she do it? Was it love, reckless and overwhelming? Was it ambition, seeing in Silius not only a lover but a partner who could rule at her side? Or was it arrogance, the belief that her power was so great, her influence so secure, that not even the emperor could challenge her? Perhaps it was all of these, entwined in a dangerous knot. For those who opposed her, this affair was no mere scandal. It was proof. Proof that she had overstepped every boundary, proof that her ambition was no longer content with influence, proof that Rome itself teetered on the edge of disgrace. Narcissus waited, silent, watching, documenting each step she took further into peril. He did not move yet, for the fall of a queen required timing as precise as the stroke of a blade. And so, the empire lived in contradiction once more. Rome gossiped, senators seethed, allies trembled, yet still Messalina and Silius walked together, radiant and defiant. The city could scarcely believe its eyes, yet it could not look away. Messalina, who had once ruled through whispers, now ruled through audacity. Her feasts had silenced rivals, her accusations had struck fear into nobles, her influence had reshaped Rome itself. But with Silius at her side, she was playing a new game, one not of politics, but of passion. And passion, unchecked, is often the most dangerous power of all. There are moments in history when ambition crosses into madness, when desire blinds even the most calculating mind. For Messalina, that moment came not with a quiet whisper, nor with a subtle scheme, but with the boldest act of her life, the decision to marry her lover, Gaius Silius, while she was still the wife of the emperor. It began, as always, with whispers. Some believed it was merely an affair grown too public, others insisted it was a plot for power. Yet Messalina pressed forward, her certainty unshaken. Perhaps she believed Claudius too weak, too distracted, too bound by affection to oppose her. Perhaps she imagined that by binding herself to Silius in marriage, she would create a new dynasty, one where she would stand not as shadow ruler but as empress in her own right, with a younger, stronger partner at her side. The ceremony itself was arranged with astonishing boldness. Invitations spread quietly but widely, senators, nobles, even priests were summoned. To refuse was dangerous, to attend was treason. And so they came, drawn into her web of audacity, compelled by fear as much as curiosity. Picture, dear listener, that villa on the day of the wedding. The sun shone warmly over marble colonnades, garlands of flowers hung from pillars, the air alive with the scent of wine and roses. Musicians played, their melodies floating through the gardens, as if it were any other noble celebration. Yet beneath the festivity was a tremor of unease, a sense that this was no ordinary union, but a fever dream unfolding before Rome's eyes. Messalina arrived radiant, her gown of silken white embroidered with threads of gold. Jewels glittered at her throat, her hair wound high with ribbons and pearls. At her side stood Silius, handsome and proud, his expression one of triumph. Together they moved through the villa as though Claudius no longer existed, as though the empire itself had shifted to make room for their reckless love. The ceremony unfolded with startling normalcy. Vows were exchanged, hands clasped, offerings made to the gods. Priests chanted solemn prayers while senators looked on in tense silence, their faces pale with dread. Cups of wine were raised, music swelled, and laughter rippled across the hall. To an unknowing observer, it might have seemed like a celebration of joy, but to those present, it felt more like standing inside a storm, watching lightning flicker across a darkening sky. Some guests drank heavily, their nerves steadied only by wine. Others whispered uneasily, questioning how far the Empress had gone, how long before this fragile illusion shattered. And still, Messalina laughed, her smile bright, her voice clear above the music. She believed herself untouchable, her power unbreakable, her future secure. But far from the villa, in another chamber of Rome, Claudius had been informed. The emperor who had trusted her, who had placed power in her hands, who had defended her against whispers of scandal, now learned that his wife had not merely betrayed him, but humiliated him before the empire. The message struck him like cold steel. For a moment, Claudius hesitated, his nature was cautious, uncertain. Yet his advisers, led by Narcissus, pressed him. This was no simple affair, they warned. This was treason. This was rebellion. If left unchecked, Messalina and Silius could seize everything, his throne, his legacy, even his life. And so, for the first time, Claudius's hesitation gave way to cold resolve. Orders were given. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite soldiers, were summoned. Their sandals struck the cobblestones in unison as they marched through the city, their armor glinting in the fading light. Word spread quickly through Rome, the emperor was moving against his own wife. Back at the villa, the celebration reached its height. Music thundered, torches blazed, wine flowed like rivers. Messalina, flushed with triumph, raised her cup high, while Silius basked in her radiance. The guests, though fearful, followed suit, their voices echoing through the halls. And then, faint at first, came the sound, boots upon the stones, steady, unyielding, growing louder with each step. The music faltered. The laughter broke. Heads turned toward the gates, where torches burned brighter than the festival lights. The Praetorians had arrived. Panic spread like wildfire. Senators scrambled from their couches, priests dropped their offerings, noblewomen fled toward the gardens. The air filled with shouts, the clatter of dishes overturned, the sudden chaos of a dream dissolving into nightmare. Messalina herself froze, her cup trembling in her hand. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her reign of power, fear touched her face. She looked to Silius, whose expression turned grim, his pride replaced with the sharp edge of realization. They had overreached, flown too high, dared too much. And now, the fall had come. The villa that only moments before had pulsed with music and celebration was transformed into a scene of terror. Guests pushed against one another, desperate to escape. Soldiers poured into the halls, their spears gleaming, their eyes fixed. What had begun as a wedding ended as an ambush, reminder that Rome, for all its indulgence, could not forgive a betrayal so bold. Outside, under the watchful gaze of the Praetorians, the celebration crumbled. The flowers, the garlands, the torches, all now seemed mocking, symbols not of triumph but of ruin. And as the villa fell silent, only one truth remained clear: Messalina's game was over. The Empress who had once ruled through whispers and feasts, through fear and desire, had finally pushed beyond the limits of power. Her audacity, once her greatest strength, had become her fatal weakness. The villa still echoed with the chaos of broken cups and fleeing footsteps when the Praetorian Guard took control. Torches hissed in the cool Roman night, their smoke rising into the air like a dark omen. Messalina, who only hours before had been radiant in her wedding finery, now found herself surrounded, not by guests and admirers, but by soldiers whose faces were stern and unreadable. Her arrest was swift. There was no trial in the Senate, no lengthy hearing before the people. This was not to be drawn out. Claudius, once her greatest protector, had finally turned against her. Advised by Narcissus and other loyal men, he realized that hesitation would invite further danger. Messalina's power had to be broken in a single, decisive act. She was led through the streets under guard, her jewels stripped away, her silks disheveled. The crowds, hearing of her downfall, pressed close to see. Some gasped in shock, unable to reconcile the mighty Empress with the trembling figure before them. Others muttered curses, recalling her feasts, her accusations, her audacity. Yet many simply watched in silence, their faces lit by torchlight, aware they were witnessing the fall of one who had ruled Rome in all but name. In the palace, Claudius sat in heavy silence. He did not rage, he did not weep, his betrayal was too deep for outward display. When the Praetorians asked for his command, Narcissus answered for him. The emperor would not grant her a trial. Her guilt was plain. Her punishment would be death. And so Messalina was led to the gardens of Lucullus, once among the finest in Rome, now a place of endings. It was a cruel symmetry, gardens she had claimed through ambition, now the ground where her life would close. Here, at last, she stood face to face with her fate. The soldiers waited, their blades ready. For a moment, fear flickered across her eyes. But then, in an instant, the old fire returned. Messalina, the girl who had once been mocked, the empress who had bent Rome to her will, straightened her back. She would not beg. She would not flee. If history was to remember her, it would be as a woman who faced death with the same boldness with which she had lived. Accounts differ, dear listener. Some say she wept, pleading for mercy. Others insist she tried to take her own life but faltered, and that a soldier finished the act. Still others whisper that she met the blade calmly, eyes fixed forward, lips set in quiet defiance. Perhaps we will never know the exact truth. Yet what lingers in memory is the image of a young woman whose audacity had carried her too far, now silenced forever beneath the cold Roman sky. When word reached Claudius, he is said to have sat motionless, his cup in hand. Only when the news was repeated did he stir, murmuring a single phrase: "She is gone." Rome itself seemed to exhale. Senators, relieved, whispered that order had been restored. Nobles reclaimed their estates, rivals breathed easier, and the city returned to its familiar rhythms. And yet, the whispers did not stop. They never do. For even in disgrace, Messalina left questions that haunted Rome. Was she only a villain, greedy, reckless, destructive? Or was she also something more? A woman who dared to rule openly in a world that denied her right to. A visionary who broke boundaries, though at terrible cost. Her name was etched into stories not with admiration, but with warning. Poets mocked her, historians condemned her, rivals cursed her memory. And yet, through all the centuries that followed, her tale endured. Not forgotten, not erased, but whispered from one generation to the next, a caution, a scandal, a legend. Close your eyes now, and imagine those quiet Roman gardens where her story ended. The torches guttering in the night air, the soldiers withdrawing, the silence heavy among the trees. The empire moved on, but the memory of Messalina lingered like a shadow among the marble walls. And so, as night deepens, we reflect, even the most powerful voices fade, even the boldest rulers fall. Yet history does not silence them completely. Their names echo in whispers, carried softly through time, reminding us of ambition, of power, of the fragile line between triumph and ruin. Rest now, dear listener. For the tale of Messalina, the empress who ruled through charm and fear, who reached too high, who fell so swiftly, is done. Her voice, once loud in Rome's marble halls, now drifts only as a faint murmur in history's night. And as you drift into sleep, remember, even when empires crumble, even when queens fall, history continues to whisper their names.